Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 15. It took me a second.
Getting
I
there.
wrote the wrong
Yeah.
episode number on my notes and had to go, what? Episode 15 of Massive Mimicry Tabletop Role Playing Podcast. Today we're going to talk about. Today we're going to talk about the differences between playing a long and a short campaign, how those look for both storyteller and for player. So, and how smash burgers fit into all of them. That's what chat was just on about, so why not? So to start off, I did want to ask what people, because I imagine this will vary some, what people consider to be a long story or campaign versus a short campaign. What is the difference for you?
Man, it's a good question. I think a short campaign is one where you're looking at, depending on where you're starting level-wise, 1, maybe 2. You're probably not getting past level 5 or 6. And that usually happens over the course of a few months, and then it's done.
Depending on the game system.
Yeah, depending on the game system.
Yeah, I think of it in terms of sessions. For me, I define a short campaign as something that's around 10-ish sessions, maybe 10 to 15 sessions, no longer than that. You're telling a story arc. You have like a single story arc in mind, and that's what you're telling. And you're going to have, 10 to 15, maybe fewer, but definitely not more than that, kind of directed sessions
Yeah,
focused on
you can
that story.
certainly stretch a somewhat smaller arc into 10 sessions by adding a few superfluous things in the middle there somewhere, but that's a good number, I think.
When you make a long campaign, you'll find that all
You're
campaigns are
not
short
wrong.
campaigns.
Not wrong. That makes it very difficult now because I'm running a campaign that is now 6, maybe even set episode 70 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know for sure. It's around there, and it's been over a year, so anything less than that feels like a very short amount of time.
Yeah. I would say just for definition purposes and for the work that goes into it. That's kind of what I'm thinking about. The work that goes into
Yeah.
it. A short campaign for me is something that's a single story. It's 10 sessions at maybe 15 at most. Anything bigger than that can be a long campaign because you're probably going to be telling more than just a single story, and you're going to have to do a lot more,
Mm-hmm.
in there. And so, how many long campaigns have you all been in?
Uh-huh.
And have they actually
Uh,
finished ever?
one I'm running, the one that we've been in. My werewolf one turned into like a 38-ish session thing. It did not finish for reasons relating to fun on my end, but
Hmm.
just the one, and now yours that you're also running is intended, as you've talked about, to go a fairly lengthy amount of time.
And we've been doing
So
that now for,
a
I
while
guess,
as well.
6 months or so.
Easily, yeah.
Yeah, probably more than that. I'm not sure.
I think dating
Um,
back as early as before April. So
Malice has been in several 2+ year games. I would say my first game that's really run long, not intended to go long, but actually run long, was the last one I did. Our first 5th edition D&D game,
Steer.
because that ended up being almost a year. It was not intended to be that long, but I didn't plan very well, and it ran a long time, a lot longer than I'd intended for. Um, and that one did finish. We did
It
come to
did.
a conclusion. I had to
We
kind of
did.
push it there a little bit because I was like, all right, we've been doing this for ages, and it was intended to not be this long. So let's get it done.
Yeah.
But it got there. It ended. Yours isn't over yet. It hasn't been canceled,
No.
but it's continuing and progressing along as a long game. And then the one I'm running right now is as well. I've had a lot of
Yeah.
games like Malice mentioned, where it was like the intention was it to be for it to be a longer running thing, but it got canceled. You hit level 5 and everyone just disappeared.
Yeah, those ones that you hope are shorter, without railroading it when players suddenly become or do what players do. You either railroad them back into position or you kind of start to adjust, and it adds a number of sessions to your list.
Um, so let's talk about some of that prep, specifically from the game master perspective.
Yeah.
The differences in between a short game and a long game when you're preparing both players and story.
Yeah. I mean, if you're looking at, if we're describing the short game, the short campaign, which we just discussed, is about a 10 session thing, a single arc, you could almost prep the entire campaign from start to end before you start it.
Hmm.
Like it's kind of like almost a
Absolutely.
book adventure. And your all your main points, and there's freedom elements there with the players, but you can kind of just have everything ready to go before you even start it. And that's not the case for a long-term campaign.
Yeah, there's a. I think create the nature of the story itself is very different. I mean, because the nature of all stories in different games and everything can be different. But when you're writing a shorter story, it's much less not entirely by any means, but it tends to be much less about the players. Generally in a longer story arc, the players are going to have a lot more say and influence. You
For
generally
sure.
assume on the story, and they certainly should have influence in a shorter story as well. But you're kind of at least going by this definition of something that's taking place over like maybe 10 sessions or so, you've got a very specific story in mind, and
Mm-hmm.
you're almost going in there with a sort of agreement usually, like, hey, this is the story we're doing, this is how we're going into it. And so the players have kind of, not always, but a lot of times the players have kind of bought into that. Like, okay, we're doing a story where it's going to be a series of heists by this criminal group that are trying to steal these things and do X. And the players are like, yes, okay, we will now build characters for that, and we know what
Yeah.
we're going to do, and that's what we're going to do. So there's a lot less risk of players just being like, I'm going to go AWOL, and in
Right.
fact, if they do that, they're jerks. Like you're like, but
Yeah.
we're specifically doing this thing.
You're
What do
kind
you
of
do?
asking them to prepare a character with the intent of you have to be involved with this. If you're playing, these are your criteria elements, and you're making a character for this story, not for your story. And to do the opposite is just derailing it.
Yeah. And now I think that can actually be a challenge a little bit for a shorter game, is balancing the player freedom aspect, trying not to railroad people into your story and making sure that through both establishing it ahead of time what kind of the players are going to be doing, but also providing enough incentives and everything to make sure that people kind of stay on track. Because it can be easier, I think, in that sort of story to end up with something that's flat, that's kind of
Yeah,
railroaded because you're like, well, this is what we came here to do, so this is what we're doing.
linear for sure. You can adjust that a little bit if you have all that extra early prep time and you're trying to get everything done beforehand by throwing in maybe 3 different paths that essentially all lead to the same final end of campaign story, but
Hmm.
each path has a few divergent elements that mix it up depending on player choice.
Yeah, I think like one of the good examples of something that's kind of an encapsulated shorter story, um, and in this case is something that's built within like a longer campaign, is going back to like Baldur's Gate and like starting off in like older Baldur's Gate, mind you, and starting off in like a city that's wrought with plague, and you can't really go anywhere else because the city is locked down because plague, and you've got to kind of navigate. You have some side quests and things you can do, but you're mostly kind of there and focus on that major issue at hand, which is plague. Um, and you know what you're getting into going in. As soon as
Yeah.
you're there, it's like, oh god, plague, we got to deal with that. That's not good. Um, and you could choose to do other things, but there's always, you're kind of directed. Let's see, malice. I'm a believer in giving any game rails. These are your race choices, class choices, and alignment choices, etc. Give them choices without crazy levels of whatever. Um, what about Plague? Where are we? Yeah, I do think to any story there is a certain degree of rails or guides that the storyteller is providing. I mean, that's what plot hooks are. You're throwing out incentives and ideas to lure them into something. Sometimes you're going to be more heavy-handed with it. Sometimes you're less heavy-handed with it. I will give an example in my longer-running game that just recently came up. My players, Brand and others, have been
Yes.
roaming the countryside of Breland for ages, hiding from authorities because they're wanted people. And I originally didn't intend that to run quite so long. And it was starting to get to the point where it was kind of dragging along much longer than I wanted it to. But I still wanted player freedom to be, like y'all can go wherever you want, you can do whatever you want. But it was starting to get to the point where I was like, narratively speaking, I don't feel like this is going in progress for a good story, because like even the players are starting to admit like we don't know where we're going. We're just going somewhere. And so I put out like a thing like, okay,
Mhm.
here's a carrot to potentially resolve this criminal issue for you if you go here and address it. We can possibly resolve this if you go there. And it kind of navigated the party to that location. I didn't say they had to go. I just provided a very big carrot. Like here's your
Yeah.
giant carrot.
It's
Nudge
it was a
nudge
much
wink wink.
wanted carrot.
we can get over this, um, perhaps, if we follow
Yeah.
that.
That's hard when you have a party who very different beliefs and goals for what's happening and different aspects for what's going on. Where one of them specifically doesn't want to get involved with any of it, and another one's outright lying about everything.
Yeah, it was deciding to start everyone off as criminals was an interesting start for a D&D game. In hindsight, I'm like, there are some things I should have done differently with that, but oh well, we're in it now.
Yeah, that's
And
part of the long campaign. Is you learn, I think, as things are happening, how to reset yourself as you're going, and you play so much that you're going to have several periods, I think, where you're going to fall back a little bit, like 2 weeks ago I should have done this instead, and
yeah,
you'll just go through that cycle throughout your whole campaign.
absolutely. You kind of learn from some things you do, and change a lot of things up as you go, especially a lot of ideas. I think that's one of the key differences in preparing for a long game versus a short game, which you touched on earlier. As for a short game, you can really kind of almost just prepare everything ahead of time. For a
Mm-hmm.
long game, you really can't. Like, you can come up with story plots, and what I do is I come up with a lot of ideas. I come up with some main ideas for what I want the main possible story plots to be, and or the main overarching story plot. And I come up with some different ideas for areas and content that I want to slot into places. But that's what they are. They're ideas that you all may never encounter. A lot of them you will never encounter, and I just
Yeah.
know that they're going to end up being on the scrap heap somewhere. Um, Whereas a short campaign, you can really kind of get away with planning and not having to improvise quite as much or do as much regular rapid planning right before a session.
Right. Uh, Definitely for a long campaign, I got to a good portion of like idea points, like level based idea points, especially when you're running a campaign that is story driven level up or milestone. Um, like at what level roughly do I think these moments could happen, and try to lead things to those points. And at a certain point, I had caught up and gotten back into, okay, now let's look at the next half of the campaign and go from there. And I'm still in a point where every few weeks I'm kind of hitting where I'm at planning wise, even though I have ideas for the later elements of things and where we're ultimately going.
And I think another thing that can be an element of this for preparation is preparing the characters or the players specifically. Thinking about if you're doing a shorter game, does that place any limitations on what you're trying to do or what you want in the player party? For instance, my example earlier, if you're going to be running a bunch of heists, if this is like an urban noir game where you're going to be doing a lot of heists and like stealing stuff, kind of Ocean's 11 or something, the players obviously need to make characters that fit with that theme, that are going to do that are going, and that could be a thing in longer games too, but I feel like, the longer games tend to be less focused on a concept or a single
Yeah,
specific type of endeavor.
for
Yeah,
sure.
clearly
And
Malice is up there.
I think that does influence things like the paladin. Like, would you actually, you might Malice, would anyone else might actually pick a paladin in a setting like that? And you start to ask those questions, like, and you have to talk to the DM, like, does this make sense? Like, maybe if you're going an evil paladin, sure. Um, but it does start to limit choices, and it's less about making a character for you and more about just making a character for the story.
And it's something that also goes into getting the party together. Now, a lot of this varies greatly because a short campaign can still have free character choice and everything, and a long campaign can decide we're going to limit it in some ways.
Yeah.
But I do think that for the shorter game, you tend to, at least if you're doing it effectively, you tend to be a little bit more constrained about how you get the party together, uh, because you're on the clock. You've got limited
Mm-hmm.
time. You're like, we got 10 sessions and we are done. Um, we don't want to mess around with meeting up in the tavern and everyone having to meet each other for the first time and then decide if they want to work together and all this stuff.
For half a
You
session,
can,
yeah.
you can, but you're going to burn an entire session on that. Um,
And that I think comes into play for the DMs in knowing how you DM and also knowing the people you're playing with, whether they're more RP focused or more
mhm.
game mechanic focused, because the RP focused people like us are just going to eat up time.
I don't trust any of you. Um, but one last thing I was thinking about with this, kind of going back to player character choice. The player characters themselves in a shorter game and a longer game, but I think especially in a shorter game, can affect the choice of the story as well, um, and the choice of the group and how the group gets together. I mean, that's kind of a thing with all campaigns. You're supposed to have your session zero usually, and have everyone talk that out. How do you want to get together, or talk out how their characters work together, and kind of what the focus of the group might be a little bit, so that no one's completely out of left field.
Right.
Um, but I feel like you have that a little bit more with a shorter campaign, where this is I was thinking about this based on one of the last 10 session stories that Tabletop to Keyboard did, where they recently did a wrap up, and they were talking about how originally they were intending to start it off and have the characters kind of get together and start off one way, but then all the players ended up making like criminals. And so it changed how they were doing it. And it was like, well, instead of doing like an escort mission, you're going to do like a heist to get because the main thing is I just need you to get this product inside the city. So
Yeah,
we're just changing how that's working. Um, and that can still apply for sure for a longer game. But like I said, I feel like the shorter games tend to be a little bit more concept focused. So that definitely, I think,
for
can
sure.
impact some of those decisions you're making, because again, you can, with a shorter game, you can really work on a lot of that ahead of time. And if you don't take those decisions into account, you're going to be even probably more tempted to railroad people into your story.
Yeah. Or allow for 2 or 3 more sessions down the road, or, maybe ask, hey, can you guys meet a second time this week so we can catch up, or, that kind of thing. One thing that could be cool for a thing like that in managing time frame and the character interaction with a short session is if going into it, like you mentioned earlier with the heist thing, you kind of know your objective going into it,
Mm.
but more importantly, like maybe who even the big bad villain is going into it, and rather than having like a buildup of surprise at the very end, this is who the evil dude is, they know from session one going into it, and you start asking them questions like, how were you once involved with this person? And you tie them into the inevitable
Yeah,
confrontation, and then you throw in your little surprises along the way.
absolutely. And another thing that you can do with that in a shorter game as opposed to a longer game, I mean, you can still do it in a longer game, but it's harder. And that is to plant the seeds of the unknown, of the, if you don't want them to know who the big bad guy is or whatever, to plant the seeds in there, the hints about who that is, or the encounters with some of that person's goons and whatnot early on. um, you can do that a lot more easily in a short game because you generally kind of know what the story is going to be all the way
Mm-hmm.
through for the most part. Whereas for a longer game, you can still do it. It's just more work because they may not bite.
Yeah.
If you have, I mean, you can try to force a main enemy on them, of course. You can always be like, no, this is my main bad guy, and I am going to shove them in your face, and you are going to have to deal with them. Um, but if you don't want to force them to be like, I'm going to deal with this one issue, uh, then you may present something like that and start dropping hints and things, and they don't pick up on them. Or they decide, you know what, we're not going to even deal with that quest. We don't even want to deal with that plot hook. We're going to go to this other town because it's a long campaign. It's open ended. We can do whatever we want.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've decided, screw that town. We don't care what that guy's doing to it. We're going to go over here. And then they go that way, and you're like, well, I just wasted all those little hints and stuff about that, didn't I?
Yeah. And then it starts getting really bad with the long campaign when you're trying to throw those in throughout the course of time, and it's like, do these add up to other things I've either done or other things I've hinted? Like, are there conflicts in continuity here? And you have to go back, and there's just lots of time invested into making sure, if you care about it, that you're doing it the right way, and not causing a problem that could have come up from it or something.
Yeah, it's definitely a concern, though I generally think, fortunately, that player memories aren't that good, and they tend to dismiss things that aren't congruous. Um,
It's
they
fair.
tend to be like, did that? Well, maybe that just wasn't a tease. I thought that was a hint, but maybe it wasn't a clue, or whatever.
It was a tease designed to make you think it was a tease.
Yes. Now, I really want to talk about player prep as well. The
Mhm.
difference for players approaching a long story versus a short story, um, and
Yeah.
what that means for the actual players themselves.
I mean, there's a lot less of it, that's for sure.
I
Um,
think just backstory first and
Huge
foremost.
thing, yeah.
Um, I mean, you could still write 10 pages of backstory for a short game if you want, but it's probably a lot less pressure too. Um,
Certainly. I think people who do that are more about just making sure they're understanding their character for the role play aspects of it. It's more
yeah.
just self helpful rather than for your story.
Yeah. I mean, that being said, a lot of people don't write that much backstory for longer campaigns either.
It's
Um,
true.
there is at least some pressure, I think, and there's a benefit to writing more backstory and giving more in-depth backstory for longer games, because a lot of that is going to come up. It's harder for the storyteller to turn around and take your childhood trauma or your family issues or whatever and stick them into a shorter campaign. It's not
Yeah.
going to come up that much,
Or at
most
all.
likely, or at all.
Yeah.
Unless you're playing a mimic, then it will be everywhere.
Yeah.
Uh,
We've touched upon in previous episodes about character development stuff, in whether the D&D or the vampire uh, series, about the evolution of character development, and that your character is never stopping through the course of your campaign. In a 10 session thing, that might not exist. You could just create your character, and that's your character
yeah.
for those 10 sessions. You don't necessarily have to worry about, how do I feel about this event? How is it going to change me? Unless you die in session 1 and you have 9 more sessions to go, and you're brought back, for the rest of those. And
Yeah, and,
typically, you're not worrying about it.
and character goals as well to fit with that. With the idea of character progression and whether or not your character is going to change much during the story, and what sort of goals they're pursuing. I mean, you can, as we've mentioned in previous episodes, you can certainly have a goal that your character is not going to achieve, and in some ways that can be fun. You can have a goal that's either impossible or one that's outside of the scope of the game. But in general, for a shorter story, most people are going to be focusing on those near goals. They're not going to be going like, I want this really long term goal that I'm going to do, and I'm not actually going to finish because we're only going to be playing for like in game
Yeah.
2 months.
It
Um,
becomes more flavor for your character.
yeah. And whereas in a longer story, you can really kind of delve out and um, try to flesh some of that out and actually see the progress. A shorter story, you're not going to see that much character progress. Some,
Yeah.
hopefully,
And if you're a
but
type of
not a
player
lot.
who wants to, who thoroughly enjoys that aspect of it, you could always talk to the DM and being like, obviously it's 10 sessions, super short. What are some things within the area that we're playing in that I might be able to utilize for some goals based off of some of these ideas? Do any of these work with the setting that might conceivably be something that could be on the road to that 10th session?
Now,
So,
one thing that I think is harder for players in preparing for a shorter game as opposed to a longer game is that work to unite the party up front.
mm,
Because as I said, I do think that you need a greater, at least to run it effectively and efficiently, you need more focus on that, more focus on upfront. How is this party coming together? How are they? Do they know each other? Are they related? Or are they, somehow part of the same organization? What are their incentives to work together? And how does all that work? And so I think you need a session 0, of course, but you really need to get into that and to talking about the group and how the group works together. Um,
yeah.
and
And
at least
the
coming up,
easiest, go ahead.
I was just say at least coming up with a basic idea for it, depending on the system. Now, some tabletop systems like Call of Cthulhu, if you're doing like a 1 or 2 session thing, it's a quick story. You don't really necessarily need, the characters are kind of impermanent anyway, so you don't really necessarily need a well contrived and super thorough reason for people to work together. But something like D&D, where the characters tend to be long lasting, they're not
Yeah.
gonna die in 1 session.
Yeah, and the
um,
easiest thing is to just skip the whole process, and as the DM say, because you're already setting the story theme and the story plot, is to just say, you know each other. How do you know each other? Why are you friends?
yeah,
And let them decide that, and then from there, they don't have to worry about all that pre-process.
yeah, or deciding. Um, you're all part of this organization. You're all part of the same group, the same guild or whatever. Now, you know each other. How do you know each other? How do you interact?
Yeah,
Do you hate each other? I mean, what is it? you've now added a compelling reason they have to work together. So now it'd be like, okay, you can dislike each other all you want or whatever the case may be. Um, that's for you all to figure out. So there's, I think,
it
some of that
works.
upfront work that a player have to or should invest in. Um, Now it's very much up to the storyteller, the game master, to organize that.
Hmm.
Get them in a group for session 0. Lead them with questions or whatever the case may be.
Absolutely.
Did you have anything else for player prep? Those were kind of my things.
I mean, we covered mostly the short-term elements there. Player prep for long-term stuff. It's stuff we've kind of covered in previous sessions as well. Just kind of
Yeah.
repeating that. Be prepared, prep to be prepped for an evolutionary, continual growth of your character, and think about it more, and more importantly, understand that you're not the only one prepping for their stories, and you're not just going to have your story come up quickly. It could be threaded, bits and pieces here, bits and pieces there. It could not come till the very end, or
Mm.
that because it's such a long story, a DM is probably spreading things out as much as he can to fill time and ideas and concepts, and it's not just all you. Someone else's story, someone else's story, someone else's story.
Evolutionary progression.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that actually segues pretty well to my final topic I wanted to talk about. Because we've pointed out a lot of negative aspects of long stories. They're a pain in the ass to prep. There's a lot
Yeah.
of work involved. Things change as you're going, so you have to do a lot of prep the week of to change and update things and prepare for that week, because they could have just decided we've been going towards this city the entire time, but you know what? To hell with that. We're going somewhere else. We've changed our minds. I had an idea. And so then you're like, gotta prep. So you're pretty much assuming you're gonna be prepping more stuff every week for that session,
Yep.
and a lot of them just get canceled. They don't come to a satisfying resolution. They end up
It's
getting
true.
canceled before the story ends, and it's always remembered as the thing that was and could have been, but didn't
Yeah.
develop. So
There's lots of reasons why that happens as well.
yeah, for sure. So, what are the perks of playing a longer game? Why invest in the long campaign?
Um, from a DM standpoint, it's super fun to be creative with this stuff. When you're enjoying what you're doing, you certainly run the risk of at some point kind of petering out with that creativity and fun. But if you like what you're doing, typically you won't. Or if the system allows you that kind of creativity, you won't, I should say. Werewolf was not the case for me. D&D is the case. It's so full of freedom for a DM when you have magic as the simple answer to all hard problems. Um, but
it certainly can be.
yeah, um, there's a lot of freedom in creating it, and when you're really getting into it, that acting element of role play and having characters, DM or players, and just watching you guys or being a part of it is really fun to see a progression of story and constantly talking about it and going through those emotions with the players.
Yeah, I think there is one pure chaos in a lot
Yeah.
of tabletop games, but especially longer stories. They are so open to just player chaos. Like Malice is talking about in chat, teleporting a dragon guardian on top of an enemy, and making them duke it out, and the DM just being like, "What?" There's so much opportunity for that, for the players to surprise you with something, and you just go, "Okay, I now have to deal with this." All right, that certainly can happen in shorter stories, but just I feel like there's a lot better environment for it in a longer story,
Hmm.
and I think um, the biggest perk for me is something that you mentioned that we were kind of discussing a minute ago, which is character and story development. You don't, for the players specifically, not for the storyteller's story that they've crafted, but a story that is truly interactive. The with a shorter story, it's harder to do that because if you're going to keep it encapsulated to a certain span of time, you kind of need to have a generally preset story in mind.
Yeah,
But with a longer campaign, you can really allow the players to pick and choose what they want to do. And that's something I especially try to focus on where like in our current I will say because it's not really much of a spoiler, but I will say in our current campaign that I'm running, there were at the campaign start, there were three possible main bad guys. I had
Mm,
three separate major story arcs in mind that the party could pursue. And throughout gameplay, I've been dropping tidbits of them like here and there, and and it's just kind of waiting. Like, what do you pick up? What do you decide to end up doing? Kind of shifts what the story is going to be focused on. That way, the players really get to pick, what they want
for
to deal
sure.
with, and sometimes what consequences they want to deal with. Like in some of the stuff we've done in your game, where we've had to make decisions on what we want to deal with first. Do we go to this camp or do we go to this camp? Um,
Yeah,
and figure
your
out what
guildmate died because of
consequences.
that.
Exactly. Um, are we gonna go deal with these mines or deal with the kobolds? We'll just deal with that. Fine. And then, oh wait, that's not cool.
Yeah, choice is always so fun to try to do. It certainly requires more prep, even
Yeah.
more than more, because you have to be prepared for either choices. And I've started to dive back into that a little bit with our campaign, and also in some areas started to diverge away from that in our campaign.
Yeah. I think as the story starts to materialize, like as the players make more choices, the number of choices whittled down because they've closed
Yeah,
off other branches. They've snipped story plots off, and they could perhaps come back. But it definitely, that's the kind of the point. The players' decisions actually alter and craft the story and how it's shaping in a way that shorter games don't really allow as easily. So I think there's a certain satisfying element to both the game story and also characters and how the characters develop.
yeah.
That the character development over time.
It's that concept of the true RPG aspect, whether you're playing like a KOTOR game or any of Bioware's major RPGs. It's that progression over time, leveling up your characters, experiencing new companions, and ultimately getting to that end destination that's been building up over time.
New
You get that feeling.
romances developing
Indeed,
for some people anyway.
for some people.
um, those are things that are hard to do in short games. Short games can be super fun and very satisfying. And I think, honestly, as a tabletop player, the I think the best experience long term is having a mixture. Getting to have some long campaigns that you play, but then also getting to have some short like one shots, mixture of one
Mm,
shots for different tabletop systems, not always sticking to the same system, playing some other
yeah,
stuff, and having some short stories where you're like, all right, we're just gonna do this thing for 5 weeks. We're gonna do this thing. You're gonna hunt a vampire and kill it. And we're like, cool, get to kill a vampire. Awesome, let's do that. Um, it's fun to mix all that stuff up. In the end, I've always had a strong liking of the long campaign. Like I've always wanted, in my heart of hearts, to do a level 1 to level 20 D&D game. But that's something, or also a really long and involved vampire campaign. But that's
yes,
something that I know like most tabletop players never get around to doing because it's just the
yeah.
sheer amount of time that takes
Yep. The more
is
time it takes,
monumental.
the harder it is. Scheduling, planning, fun factor. It's just so hard.
Yeah, I mean, we're taking several weeks break from mine right now because with holidays coming up, people having like going vacations and work issues and stuff, We're just like, all right, let's take a break. We're not going to do this over, the holiday because people are doing stuff. But
Yeah.
while doing that, I'm sitting there thinking the whole time, like, how many campaigns have I had where we had to take a break because people were moving or something and we never resumed
Mm,
because we never could get back together?
yeah. So
Uh,
it's super important to do any, especially long-term campaigns, is to try as often as possible to just keep going through it. And you kind of have to prep at the very beginning of your campaign, knowing that, like, if we really want to get through the end of this, we need to play basically every week. Maybe take a week off here, a week off there, worst case scenario. But that means you have to have enough people to still play. So you have to
yeah.
maybe open up another seat, have, one extra player at your table that you may not have wanted, just to be able to fill a gap. We didn't do that with mine necessarily, but it's a good idea to do it.
Yeah, and that was like a specific thing with mine. Like we had conversations over how many players we should have and went back and forth a little bit and I finally was like, okay, I want to add one more person because we have two people that I know are going to be a little shaky. And like if we have just four people and one of them is gone, how is the party going to function? But if we have
Yeah.
five people and one of them is gone, that doesn't really matter so much. I can play that other person and we can get by. It's a lot easier. And in some cases, with two people gone, even though that's generally my rule, is if two people are gone, we don't meet. Unless that one of them cancels on me like the day of, then I'm like, to hell with you, we're still doing it. Um, so, uh, but even with two people gone, it's kind of doable. You still have
Yeah.
some people who can role play together, who can make decisions, and at
Yeah.
least get some progress.
If you want the help, your players can certainly assist to take some of the load off of you by sharing the character sheets, assuming it's safe to do so, and have them make all the rolls, and you just sideline the personality of the character.
Yeah, which always feels awkward, but sometimes that is one of the
Totally.
things with a longer game. It always feels awkward to continue without people and to just have someone play them, or more in the case, usually not really playing them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Usually the DM or the storyteller just not really playing them at all and just rolling for them. Unless someone decides to be a jerk and be like, what do you think?
Yeah.
Fine, I will role play them.
That's me. That's me.
Oh, because I also hate doing it because I don't want to make choices for someone else's character.
Right.
So I'm like,
Right. You have to have that
I don't know.
conversation beforehand, or that trust, and yeah.
So there's a lot of problems with, but I think a lot of really good perks. I think a long campaign can be extremely satisfying, more so than shorter games, but it's very difficult to reach that
Yeah,
satisfaction. You have to. It takes a lot of work from everybody.
it
Um,
does. So much work. You have to commit to it. When you start one, you have that conversation ahead of time. Like, this isn't just a 30 session thing that turns into a 200 session thing. We're going for 200 sessions. Are you okay with that? If not, you can walk away right now. Don't commit, please. I really don't
yeah.
want you to. If you don't believe you can be here for 2 years, obviously life is life, and
Stuff happens, but
yeah. But with the intent going in, we're okay. And as DMs, it takes a lot of work mentally and just time. And I spend 2 full days usually, like my Friday nights, all of Saturday, just
you
prepping
do a
for
lot
it,
of
and
prep.
then throughout the week, like small prep, like idea thinking, small writing.
Hmm.
It takes a lot of effort from a DM to do it. Maybe I do too much, but even without me doing too much, it's still a lot of work. So be committed to doing the work.
There's there are some weeks where I feel bad because you're like, I've been working on this for like 3 days, and I'm like, I didn't do that much prep this week. In some sessions, y'all get like a couple sessions ago, y'all got nothing done, and I was just like, great, I don't have to do any prep next week. That's awesome.
Yeah, those weeks are satisfying, but also like not satisfying at the same
Yeah,
time.
it,
Typically,
it's a little frustrating because it's like I want to get to things in the story, and that's why, like I
Yeah.
mentioned, adding a giant carrot to be like, all right, let's move this along a little bit, because I was like, there's things I want to get to in the story. I want to get us to some actual like stuff eventually,
Yeah.
and I was like, we might just end up wandering the countryside for another 10 sessions, and we gotta move this along somewhere. Um,
Yeah. It's largely about the details when you're planning long-term stuff at the very beginning, especially, is don't focus on details, focus on larger picture, time frame, story ideas,
yeah,
uh, and then week to week look at the details of where we're going next few weeks, start doing that. But even then, don't get too dragged into the details, because it all kind of flows better while you're doing it. Like, you can make stuff up on the spot, let the players inform what you plan and in the moment, and you don't have to have every little thing written down or prepped.
yeah. I've been playing DMing and running games online for so long now that I feel like the next time I actually DM in person, it's going to be awful, because I've
Yeah.
been spoiled by the benefits of having like a Google sheet with
Hmm.
NPC names and stuff on it, and I could be like, oh, it's just so
You're just gonna have
beautiful.
like laptops and monitors instead of a DM screen, and
And like Malice is talking about improving based on what the characters do, and I'm like, have my improv skills been diminished by these
right?
tools, by having two monitors with spreadsheets and stuff that I can be like, ooh, I got stuff. You go to a tavern, I can be like, all right, I got a list of taverns. Click, look at that.
Yeah.
It's
It's
awesome. It's
like
done.
your player's like, I'm gonna investigate the hallway for traps. It's like, well, I didn't plan a trap, but you know what? We'll play this a trap right there. And it's like on the spot, like, yeah, you know what? You find a trap. Now you must deal with it.
But anyway, um, as I said earlier, I do think there's a lot of great things about shorter stories as well. Um, and they could be
Yeah.
short stories are very satisfying in the short term, because
Yeah.
and more often than not they work out and you have a satisfying story, because long term games don't often finish. um, but they're still very much worth trying. And so I think that's pretty much it for tonight. I want to thank everybody for coming and hanging out. I do have more streams Friday and Sunday. I've been doing Cyberpunk. I'm going to continue to do that on Fridays and Sundays going forward for a while. I don't know. I guess till people get tired of watching. Um, and remember, if it's a script, it's probably not a mimic. Good night, everybody.
Good night.